For the next 3 weeks, we'll be discussing the executive branch, which is the roles and power of the president, the cabinet, the role of the president and the cabinet in lawmaking and their interaction with the legislative branch. And we'll conclude that by finishing with a mock Senate, which is based on some committees that are close to those cabinet positions. But we'll start with a few of these PowerPoint presentations that you will watch at home. And as I'm talking, feel free to stop, rewind, and get notes on what I'm saying as well as what's on the slide. So the guiding question for this presentation is, what are the prime duties of the presidency, the single most powerful office in the nation, and how is the president selected? The president is the leader of the executive branch. So the Constitution sets up the president as the leader of the branch that executes law, as we've discussed before. The Constitution grants specific powers to the president, the power as commander-in-chief. This means that the president is the head of the military, as well as the authority to appoint heads of executive departments, federal court judges, and other top officials, the duty to ensure that all the laws of the United States are faithfully executed, thus the executive branch. So, as we've talked about before, the role of the president and the executive branch is to execute law to make sure that all laws are upheld. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution defines the formal requirements for the presidency. A natural-born citizen of the United States means that the president must be born within the United States. Also, the president must be at least 35 years of age and a resident of the United States for 14 years, meaning they've lived within the country for the last 14 years. Other presidential qualifications, not constitutional ones, but practical ones, would be looking at the spectrum that we talked about last semester. Most candidates are neither extremely liberal nor conservative. Usually candidates are selected by their party for being more moderate, meaning they're more electable from either side. The other thing, and has more practically worked out recently, is running for presidency demands large amounts of money from one's supporters and one's own finances. The chart, or the image you see on the right side there, shows you the fundraising so far for this campaign in 2012. Part of the reason you see, and so you can see how much money, $32 million, the leading Republican candidate, which is Mitt Romney. Now looking at the presidential term and succession, originally the Constitution did not specify how many four-year terms a president could serve. There was a precedent set by George Washington. After his second term, he stepped down, and up until the 20th century, that was followed as just a general unwritten precedent. The 22nd Amendment, however, passed in 1951, limited the president to 2 terms, which is 8 years total, 2 four-year terms. This amendment was passed after a few presidents had tried to run for a third term, as well as, most notably, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected 4 times and died in his 4th term. So shortly after that, Congress passed the 22nd Amendment. The 25th Amendment clarifies the rules for presidential succession, or what happens if the president should die or be removed from office. The first in line to take over for the president is the vice president. If while the president is in office there is a vacancy at vice president, the president appoints a new one. The chart on the left there just shows the line of succession. So the vice president is first and then the Speaker of the House. So that chart on the left just gives you a line of who would take over for the president. The Constitution gives the vice president 2 duties. So in the office of the president in the executive branch, in addition to the president, you have the vice president. The Constitution gives that person 2 duties. The vice president resides over the Senate and votes in that body in case of a tie. Under the 25th Amendment, the vice president helps decide whether the president is disabled and acts as president should that happen. So this 25th Amendment was passed again to give the vice president power in that gray time between him officially taking over and the president being out of office. Before we get to the cabinet and those people you saw in that chart on the left side of that last slide, we need to discuss the Electoral College. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution establishes the Electoral College. Each state legislature would set up a method for choosing people who would be the electors. The electors would meet in their state at election time and cast their electoral vote for president. So initially, the Electoral College system was not a popular vote. Each state legislature who was popularly elected would vote for electors for president. And those votes, the electoral votes, would be the deciding factor for the presidential election. In the original system, electoral votes from all the states would be counted in a joint session of Congress. A lot of this had to do with technology at the time and the amount of work it would take to actually take a popular vote in the 17 and 1800s. The candidate receiving a majority greater than half of the voting population, or in this case, the electoral votes, would become president, and the candidate with the second highest number would become vice president. Now, today, the vice president is chosen by the president as a running partner, and they're elected together. But at the time, the second highest vote getter would become the vice president. So the original Electoral College system also provided that if no candidate receives a majority of electoral votes, the House chooses from the 3 candidates with the largest number of elector votes. So in this case, Congress would be the deciding factor. There were cases in the 19th century or 1800s where people clearly didn't have the popular vote or the even the electoral vote, and Congress chose them as president. That hasn't happened recently. You can see from the chart on the next slide, and we'll see that in a second, where this has happened recently, where the electoral vote was different than the popular vote. And we'll talk about how the system has changed as well. Today, the Electoral College system has changed a bit. Today, parties choose their nominees for president in a convention held in late summer. Voters are not voting directly for president or vice president, but instead voting for all of their party's electors, the slate of electors in their state. So what happens is there is a vote that happens, as you can see on that chart on the right, the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and all voters cast their ballot for state electors. Those electors are then pledged to vote for that particular candidate in December. So in December, the winning electors in each state meet their state capitals to cast their votes for president and vice president. This means that the popular vote controls the electoral vote. In the past, that wasn't a part of the popular vote or the electoral vote. Now they work together. This still creates times in which the popular vote can be different than the electoral vote. As you can see in the election in 2000 at the bottom of that chart on the right side of the screen, Albert Gore won 48.4% of the popular vote versus Bush 47.9%. But the Electoral College votes, because of the amount in each state, was different, and we go off of the electoral vote. This is something that we will look at more in class and we'll discuss in more depth because it does get confusing, and trying to understand the difference between these two things is very important. We see this difference between the popular and electoral vote again here on this slide. This map of the U.S. in the 2000 and 2008 elections shows the popular vote versus the electoral vote. Often, the popular vote is much closer than the electoral vote, and if it is similar, it can, as we see in 2000, even go the other way. So take a minute and look at this map, and it should help make sense. Remember that each one of those states has a number of electoral votes that they are getting. So Colorado has a certain number, and Texas has a certain number, and so the amount of votes coming out of those states is different than the number of people or the percentage of people voting for president. We'll go into more depth on all of these elements in the next few PowerPoints, but the last thing we're going to talk about, the last two things we're going to talk about in this slideshow are the cabinet and the executive office of the president. These are both parts of the executive branch that support and assist the president and vice president in carrying out their duty to execute the law. The cabinet, as you can see on the right, there's a list of what the cabinet is and why they exist. But the cabinet is 15 major executive department heads that the president appoints. The 15 secretaries, as they're called, the vice president, and several other top officials make up this cabinet. The cabinet is just a word for a group of advisors selected by the president. Before making final cabinet decisions, member of the president-elect's team may leak or deliberately disclose some candidate's names to the news. This process is used to help the president see how well those choices will be taken by the public and by Congress in the next slideshow, we will talk a little more about how the president needs public support to be able to carry out everything he promised in his campaign and everything that he seeks to carry out. As I said before, the chart on the right side shows why each one of these cabinet positions and each one of these departments or executive departments is needed. You can see the top four, the inner cabinet there, are the most important because they're vital to the running of the country. The Departments of State, Treasury, Justice, and Defense were the original four inner cabinet positions. As the country expanded westward, as more and more commercial and agricultural land were added, and different issues arose, more of these outer cabinet positions were added. And as you can see, the most recent is the Homeland Security Department, or the Department of Homeland Security. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq, this department became more and more a necessity. Each of these cabinet members is responsible for the department that he or she heads up and runs. These departments have different roles, and we'll talk more about that later. But as a group, the cabinet is intended to serve as an advisory body to the president. Some cabinet members are more important or have greater influence than others. They're often known as the inner cabinet, which I discussed already, and they're concerned with the most sensitive national issues, issues of defense and money and the law and the connection to other parts of the country and other parts of the government. The cabinet in general is the main advisor to the president. This body of people keeps the president informed on issues around the country, issues with foreign policy, and issues with really anything that pertains to their specific department and the government in general. The last thing we'll talk about is the Executive Office of the President. The Executive Office of the President was created by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Congress in 1939 to serve the needs of each administration. So each of these department, each administration needs staff to help run things. Today, the EOP staff includes attorneys, scientists, social scientists, and other highly technical or professional personnel. So as each of these department heads and each of these elements that we'll get into more of the executive branch report out on different topics regarding foreign policy and the Treasury, and they need people who can collect data and to make it run more efficiently. The graph you see there on the bottom right is a graph of the number of people in the executive office, and it just shows the size of the government, the size of the executive branch. And more of that's just an interesting look at the change in the size of the executive branch over time. The final thing that we'll talk about is the National Security Council. This is a part of that executive office of the president, and it was created to advise the president and to coordinate U.S. military and foreign policy. So all of the foreign policy and military obligations of the president can get a little overwhelming. So Congress created this council to advise the president on military strategy and different foreign policy issues. A special assistant, the National Security Advisor, directs this staff. And throughout history, this has been a very important member of the executive branch. Different wars have been very much on the shoulders of the National Security Advisor. That picture there is just an example of how the National Security Council works with the president. That's President Johnson looking at a model of one of the battles during the Vietnam War, and you can see they're actually working out military strategy and understanding how the war is going in what's known as the Situation Room. And this is a place for this type of council and activity to happen. Next time we'll talk more about the powers of the president and move on from there.